Mr. Adrian Shtuni, thank you for joining us today and thank you for finding time for the interview. So we would like to talk about on Kosovo's experience of repatriation and rehabilitation of women and children. And first question is to start with, Kosovo repatriated about 120 women and children from the Middle East. Could you tell us what kind of approach has been taken in Kosovo in rehabilitating and reintegrating them?
Sure. Thanks for this opportunity to discuss together on this important topic. In the past few years, Kosovo has taken the lead in Europe in repatriating its citizens from Syrian IDP camps and prisons. It has so far repatriated about 124 of its citizens. Many countries' constitutions and national laws, as well as international conventions and UN Security Council resolutions, bind countries to protect their citizens' rights, ensure the children's well-being, investigate war crimes committed by their nationals, and bring terrorists to justice. Unfortunately, very few countries have repatriated their citizens from Syria or have brought those who committed crimes to justice. Keeping this in mind, it is very significant that Kosovo, a very small and modestly resourced country, that is yet to become a member of the United Nations or a signatory of relevant international conventions on human rights or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, has adopted a more responsible behavior towards its citizens and toward international law than many other countries. Simply put, I'd say that the path chosen by Kosovo is that of proactive repatriation of its citizens from Syria. This approach is the most viable approach, be that from a legal, moral perspective or from a long-term security perspective, simply because coordinated repatriation allows for better risk and threat management. It is an approach that in essence reduces the risk of the so-called Islamic State's reemergence in Syria and Iraq. And to conclude, I'd say that Kosovo has shown very strong leadership, not only by repatriating its citizens, but also by providing to them, to the individuals that it has repatriated, a tangible rehabilitation and reintegration path without delay.
Thank you very much. So, as an expert that knows all details of this rehabilitation process in Kosovo, can we start with the very first stage of rehabilitation programs? So what happened to returnees after the flight landed in Kosovo? I imagine they were brought to the rehabilitation center somewhere and quarantined, right? And could you tell us about the very first stage, like quarantine, medical checks, and legal assessment?
Yes, they were brought to initially to a reception center. That's correct. That's and they were quarantined for a period of 3 days. The 72-hour emergency protocol was coordinated by the Division for Prevention and Reintegration, which falls under the Ministry of Interior Affairs of Kosovo. And the process included medical checkups, psychiatric and psychological evaluations of the repatriated individuals, then also screening by law enforcement for obvious reasons. They are coming from a war zone and involved in or with terrorist organizations, so that was done as well. There were interviews by social workers to identify the immediate needs of the individuals that were repatriated. And after spending that initial 72 hours quarantined, the returnees were released to the care of their extended families, their blood relatives, except for, of course, male individuals who were arrested and were so basically they were detained upon arrival. The fact that all repatriated children and women, including the orphan children, were released to the care of their extended family, signaled an initial level of acceptance with potentially beneficial effects to the returnees' adjustment and reintegration process. Then the returnees were registered with the Civil Registry Office, were issued personal identification cards because some of them didn't, most of them actually didn't have current ID cards, or some of the children who were born there didn't have any identification document. They were also included in social assistance schemes so they could receive some financial support. Were provided with housing accommodation, were vaccinated, were provided dental services, follow-up checkups, and so on.
You mentioned male fighters. So I was thinking that in that repatriation operation, Kosovo repatriated only women and children. So which means male fighters also were brought back, yes, some of them. And also, could you tell us more about voluntary returnees in Kosovo? If they have some in Kosovo, how many male fighters returned on their own way? And there are also women among voluntary returnees or not?
Of course, there has been voluntary returnees over the years. Basically, I think there's the total number of returnees from Syria to Kosovo over the years is 255, which means that includes individuals who spontaneously or voluntarily returned over the years to Kosovo. So basically, the overall number of returnees from Syria and Iraq, of nationals, of Kosovan nationals, is double the number of those who have been repatriated by the government. So I mentioned that there was 12 individuals who were repatriated and then investigated and found guilty. There, among the individuals who voluntarily returned, primarily, I would say they were male individuals. Many of them stayed very short period of time, stayed for a very short period of time in Syria and Iraq and returned after a few weeks or months. So even there, let's say the risk they pose might be less intense than compared to the ones who were repatriated and spent 4 or 5 years affiliated and active within terrorist organizations. Some of them have not been prosecuted because at the time that they traveled to Syria and Iraq, traveling there was not criminalized, and the organizations that they joined were not designated terrorist organizations. So it was problematic in terms of what crime they may have committed, or whether there was under the criminal law of Kosovo, there was an act that could be prosecuted.
Thank you, Mr. Shtuni. Do you think there are other Kosovar citizens still remaining in Al-Hol-Rosh camps or other prisons in northern Syria or Iraq?
Yes, there is evidence, there is numbers, and yes, there are other citizens of Kosovo, as well as Albania, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, from the countries of Western Balkans that are still held in IDP camps and in prisons in northern Syria. The situation is precarious there, we know that. But generally speaking, I think these countries of the Western Balkans and Kosovo in particular have repatriated a significant portion of their citizens, although some remain, and hopefully all of them will be repatriated soon.
If you analyze the generally rehabilitation and reintegration programs in Kosovo regarding the returnees, civil society organizations have been involved in the process or not? And if yes, what kind of role they are playing in the rehabilitation?
Sure. So civil society, the participation of civil society organizations in rehabilitation and reintegration efforts has been so far, let's say, limited to a few programs. First, I would mention they have participated in programs focused on building some primary healthcare providers' capacities to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in children, the repatriated children, providing some limited psychosocial interventions in the school setting. They've also provided training to social workers to support the process of reintegration of returned children. But broadly, they haven't worked directly closely with the returnees, but have worked more with first-line practitioners and have tried to build their capabilities, their capacities that would then facilitate the process of rehabilitation and reintegration. So I would say that generally speaking, civil society organizations remain an untapped resource. There is a much wider role that especially community-based organizations in rehabilitation and reintegration can play in rehabilitation and reintegration efforts, not only because they're best placed within the communities, they have the pulse of their communities, they understand what's going on in their communities, the communities where returnees have returned, but also because the involvement of these organizations can make possible the design of organic models of rehabilitation and integration that can use local capabilities, capacities more efficiently and facilitate a more sustainable local solution to this issue, rather than having everything centralized and fully controlled by the state entities or from the capital city, which is it's unlikely to result in the outcomes that we're all looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Shtuni. Very important and interesting insights. And as we all know that majority of returnees usually are children.
Yes.
So let's talk about children in Kosovo. So can you tell us more about rehabilitation and reintegration of children returned from the Middle East, and what kind of reintegration programs in place, and what about schooling of children and working with the post-traumatic syndrome? And do you have, does Kosovo have enough practitioners on the ground?
Very good questions. I'll give you some initial thoughts from the interviews I've had with first-line practitioners and from my recent trips to Kosovo. The number of repatriated children so far, I think, stands at about 80. As expected, the repatriated children's revealed signs of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder upon return to Kosovo. That was characterized by sleeplessness, anxiety, depression, panic, triggered by loud noises such, for example, airplanes flying overhead or firecrackers, fireworks, all of that. After their release from the reception center that I mentioned earlier, the 72 hours protocol, the mental health team, a small team of very dedicated individual practitioners, provided 24/7 phone consultations to returnees and their receiving families to accommodate them in this new reality, to accommodate them in terms of the initial interactions with the families where they return to, and the closer communities, the small communities where they returned. The children have been participating in a number of activities, be it cultural or sports activities that have been primarily supported by international organizations. And this was done in order to prepare them for their transition into the formal education system. They've also received arts and games therapy to help them deal with trauma, with anger, or grief. Let's not forget that these children have seen a lot. They've gone through traumatic events. They've seen relatives die in front of them in some cases, or they've been subjected to all sorts of violence. So they're very traumatized. And so this arts and games therapy helps them deal with those feelings of anxiety, anger, trauma, and helps them express and manage their feelings in non-verbal ways, because in some cases there's also been issues with the language, because some of the returnees did not speak the local language because they were born in Syria or Iraq, and in some cases they didn't even have any surviving parents. So it's been challenging, but within, I think, 6 months of their return, most minors of schooling age were integrated in the formal education system. There were expected developmental delays among some of them because they had not, followed they had not been enrolled in schools, formal schools where they were living, and so there has been observed some delays in their development. And they were, in these cases, integrated in the formal education system, but in lower grades than their age. And so that was done to accommodate this schooling gaps and difficulties that they may have had with the local language. So they have received some support in that regard as well. So the mental health unit also reportedly started holding individual sessions with their child returnees and their mothers, and then later on they started integrating other members of the wider family into this joint sessions, which in my view it's a very helpful practice.
Thank you very much. Regarding the female returnees, reintegration and rehabilitation of female returnees also has own challenges, and it's a long-term process. And what kind of practices are in place in Kosovo to make them economically independent, equipping them with new skills?
Very good question. So with the support of international organizations active in Kosovo, repatriated women have received some training, starting with parenting training. And that was important because let's not forget that some of these women who returned to Kosovo with 3, 4, or 5 children from various marriages, they left as very young girls. Basically, they left as young teenagers when they were 17, 18, or 19. So yes, it's challenging to return after a few years, and they're very young, and you have 3 or 4 or 5 children. So they have received this parenting training. They also received some sewing, cooking, and sewing trainings that were set to, and they were also set to receive some tools and supplies, so they could probably, start their own private enterprises, small businesses in sewing and cooking. This, let's say, skills development programs constitute in themselves encouraging steps that could enhance employment opportunities, including self-employment. Nevertheless, the country has quite a high rate of unemployment, which is a problem, and the returnees, especially the women, have limited work experience, so that makes their job placement process not exactly easy. There's also the fact that, as I mentioned, the majority of the women that were repatriated were sentenced, and so they were prosecuted, and so that kind of, in a certain way, limits the options that they may have to, for example, take a bank loan to start for self-employment, to start their own businesses, because again of their criminal record and the lack of professional experience, and also, as I mentioned, there is the element of very problematic job market, because there is not a lot of opportunities for employment. So definitely economic independence is a challenge, I would say, that needs to be receiving more attention. In many cases, families of returnees are composed of multiple minors and only one caretaking mother, while the other parent, in most cases, is either deceased. So either they died in Syria and Iraq, or they are unable to provide financial support because they are in prisons. So the families of returnees mostly rely on monthly welfare check that is received by the government, that may not be, in essence, sufficient to fulfill the needs of the whole family, making the families of returnees somewhat vulnerable and possible targets of radicalization networks, who are well positioned to exploit these situations of vulnerability, especially in times of economic distress, such as the situation created, be that during the COVID pandemic or the current economic situation with high inflation and limited employment opportunities. So it's a very good question, and I think this particular issue requires a lot more attention, because radicalization networks have not disappeared. They still exist in the same communities where these individuals were radicalized and recruited in the first place.
Yes, and something that is controversial in rehabilitation of female returnees, especially in Central Asia, for example, in Kazakhstan, this happened when the government provided with free accommodation some female returnees. So in Kosovo, I heard that some women who were repatriated from Syria, they received some small grant from the government. Could you tell us more about this kind of special support from local government, if there were some accommodation or small grant subsidies or education quota?
That's a very good question, but I do not have specific information on particular grant programs. I know that, again, they were provided training. They were provided, or they were supposed to receive some supplies so they could start their own businesses. But it's a problematic space because, again, you need to make sure that the resources that are being provided will not be used for activities that are illegal. And so you need a lot of supervision in these cases when you're providing that support, which in my view, it is critical to provide, but it's very thorny as an issue. It's controversial because also when you're providing support, financial support, supplies to people who returned from Syria, in environments that are struggling economically, you might have a neighbor, saying, okay, but so am I supposed to go to Syria and Iraq to get a subsidy and to get a grant? Why would you give a grant to somebody who was just sentenced for terrorism and went to a country and broke the law? And so it is a very sensitive issue and needs to be handled with a lot of care, not only for the reasons I mentioned in terms of how will the grant be used, and will it be used for in legal ways, but also you need to manage the sentiments within communities where that have received these returnees, because there could be some tensions being generated if the returnees receive grants, but the neighbors don't, and that could be problematic.
Yeah, you are right. This is exactly happening in other countries, especially in Central Asia. So if you look at the rehabilitation programs in general, so in Kazakhstan, for example, Kazakhstan program has very strong religious pillar, ideological pillar. So in Kosovo, if there is some experience of involving imams, local mosques to talk to these people, to returnees, and explain the difference between true classical Islam and the Salafi Wahhabi ideology.
Yes, there has been some initiatives that I'm aware of to include religious leaders in the rehabilitation and reintegration process of adults who have been repatriated from Syria. Mostly, I'm aware of some interventions in the prison setting with male returnees, but there has also been efforts to integrate female preachers. In Kosovo, they're called mualima, in the reintegration of women returnees. These female preachers work not only with the returnees, so not only with the women that have returned, but also with the receiving communities to help prevent potential marginalization or stigmatization of returnees, and to help to foster a more receptive environment towards the returnees. Part of the rehabilitation project includes regular meetings based on a few interviews I had locally there. So they have meetings with neighbors and villagers in these communities to try to smoothen out any kind of tensions that there might be there, because there is, unfortunately, there is some tensions, and as we've seen even from surveys, not only in Kosovo but everywhere else, there is a reluctance to welcome back into communities from a portion of communities these returnees. And so it is good to be reminded that reintegration is a complex process that goes much beyond those that have returned. And I think that approach is interesting, and I think it is worth highlighting. The fact that they are working with receiving communities, not only with the returned individuals.
Thank you very much. I think it's now time to talk about good practices, lessons learned. So maybe we start with the good practices in Kosovo. So what kind of good practices you would highlight in the rehabilitation and integration process in Kosovo?
Well, I'd say that, it starts from the beginning. I'd say that the most obvious and main good practice is that by taking full responsibility for its citizens and by administering justice without delay for those who have committed crimes in Syria and Iraq, I think Kosovo is opening a tangible path to the returnees' rehabilitation or integration into mainstream society without delay. And that's critical, because the more the return or the repatriation is delayed, the more the rehabilitation and reintegration of these individuals is delayed, and the slimmer the chances of a rehabilitation, positive rehabilitation and reintegration in society. It has also, and I say positive reintegration in society because we always never discuss the fact that there is two efforts to reintegrate returnees. There is one that we are talking about right here, to rehabilitate and reintegrate returnees into mainstream society, right? But there's also that effort to reintegrate returnees into the radicalization networks of violent extremists. Let's not forget that there is competition, that the returnees are not returning into a space that we control and that we can take our time to shape as we please, and that we can work with returnees when we have the resources, when we have the time. I would say there is an urgency that we need to compete with these radicalization networks that are still there. And as I mentioned earlier, in times of vulnerability, they become even more active by providing social services, by providing support, by pulling them back into the same networks where they initially fell prey of. Another, I would say, thing that probably is important to highlight is that Kosovo has provided repatriated children with opportunities to overcome their trauma, with the support of dedicated teams of practitioners, psychologists, social workers, have provided opportunities to participate in cultural and sports activities that I mentioned earlier, received arts and games therapy, and all the rest. So this is the transition into formal education without delay. I think it's a very good practice. It is actually priceless, because by framing the rehabilitation and integration of children returnees through an education lens, I think we are moving in the right direction, rather than criminalizing the space and not focusing immediately on their education needs and dealing with their trauma right from the get-go. And another thing I would highlight would be that reintegration, as I said, is an equation with multiple variables. There is no guarantee that repatriated individuals will be rehabilitated and reintegrated successfully. It is a long and difficult process that does not come with any of those guarantees, but the act of repatriation in itself from IDP camps and prisons, where individuals are faced with degrading conditions, is also one of the most effective counter messages to the hateful narratives of the so-called Islamic State and other terrorist organizations. So yes, repatriation is critical. Repatriation without delay and framing the approach towards returnees, especially the children, through an education lens. I think these are critical aspects, and I think Kosovo is doing very well when it comes to these aspects.
Thank you, Mr. Shtuni. So my last question is about the main challenges. So what kind of challenges and problems faced by the Kosovo government, and how it has been dealing with them? And also, what are the lessons learned for now?
Sure. I mean, it is important to discuss challenges. And as I mentioned, Kosovo is a small country with limited resources. Unfortunately, even first-line practitioners are not in abundance, so there is a shortage of personnel, there is shortage of funding, there is, for example, a shortage of social workers and psychologists in the communities where the returnees have been relocated, because and that is one of the let's say issues, that everything is sometimes overly centralized for reasons that have to do with the fact that there is not enough resources and capacities. So basically, I would say also programs are heavily dependent on foreign donors and funding that cannot be easily accounted for, cannot be cannot be guaranteed at the end of the day, because it's very hard. It is very hard to plan programs and rehabilitation or integration approaches if you do not have knowledge of what resources will be available to you, what resources will be allocated to you if you're a civil society organization or a local government entity. So that is a bit of a struggle. So what I would say is that there are certain lessons learned and some policy recommendations I'd say that I can provide. One of them is to integrate representatives of local government and civil society organizations much more in all aspects of rehabilitation and integration processes, by allowing a more meaningful role for local government authorities in leveraging the expertise of community-based organizations at be that at the national policy and strategy development level, be that at the implementation level. It is possible to design, as I mentioned, organic rehabilitation and integration models and projects that can use local knowledge, local capabilities, local sensitivities, all of that, all the capabilities more efficiently and facilitate more sustainable solutions. The other thing I'd say is there needs to be support for tailored municipal or regional rehabilitation or integration plans that need to be aligned with the strategic priorities of the national CVE strategy. But again, this is more focused on the specific needs of the particular municipalities, the particular communities, because all communities are not the same. Even within a country, you have very diverse dynamics in specific communities. And if there is more integration of legal of local entities, local government entities working hand in hand with local civil society organizations and coordinating better with the central level, there is going to be more of a positive dynamic generated and more focus on dealing with the specifics of each community, rather than just having this one size fits all approach. Another recommendation that I would have is to provide repatriated families with sufficient financial assistance and opportunities for economic, be it independence or stability, in order financial independence or economic stability, in order to avoid further radicalization. As I mentioned earlier, this is critical because returnees are vulnerable, returnees are traumatized. In some cases, they are still radicalized. And so they also face the limited employment opportunities that I mentioned earlier. And it's important to be aware of this, especially when it comes to women, but also teenagers. Basically, the minors who are more vulnerable than the others, the younger ones, when it comes to falling prey of radicalization networks. The other thing that I would mention, I mean, probably the final thing that I would mention as a recommendation would be to develop communications strategy for engagement with receiving communities and the press, especially when it comes to rehabilitation or integration projects, but also broadly speaking about projects that focus on preventing and countering violent extremism in general. And I say this because I mentioned it earlier that pre-repatriation polls in various countries, not only in Kosovo, have revealed that a considerable number of respondents do not support repatriation of citizens from Syria and Iraq and are reluctant to accept them in their communities. In order to discourage this negative or stigmatizing messaging against returnees and potential resentment linked to, as I mentioned earlier, any assistance, financial assistance they may be receiving, it is important for central and local government officials to adopt a clear public engagement strategy that will engage with community members and the public, broader public, clearly, sufficiently, and consistently, and to discuss the communal benefits of the returnees' rehabilitation and reintegration. And the goal should be to manage the public discourse on returnees, to use positive narratives, to provide updates on government efforts to rehabilitate and reintegrate, and to inform the public basically about the positive progress in order to assuage their concerns and to foster support for successful reintegration of returnees.
Mr. Shtuni, thank you very much for this very important and insightful interview. And thank you for the recommendations also. I think they will be very useful for all UN member states.
You're welcome.